In the fog-shrouded hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the whispers of the past cling to the Spanish moss like funeral shrouds, lies a tract of land that time has tried to forget. It is a place where the soil is stained with secrets, and the very trees seem to recoil from the memory of what they have witnessed. For decades, the old Wycliffe Institute for Wayward Youth stood there, a monument to supposed charity and progressive thinking, its spires reaching for a heaven it would never know. But in the spring of 2023, a team of surveyors, tasked with mapping the forgotten property for a new state park, stumbled upon a reality far more hellish. Beneath a collapsed apple orchard, their ground-penetrating radar painted a chilling mosaic of anomalies, a series of disturbances in the earth that were too uniform, too deliberate to be natural. An excavation was ordered, and what was unearthed challenges everything we thought we knew about one of the Gilded Age's most celebrated philanthropic families. They found graves, 148 of them unmarked, unhallowed, containing the slender bones of children and adolescents who had vanished from a world without a trace. These were not the victims of some forgotten plague or a tragic accident. Recently unsealed county archives and the frantic, suppressed journals of a former staff member tell a different story. A story of systematic evil masquerading as benevolence. This is the story of the Wycliffe family and the magnificent institution they built to conceal one of the darkest chapters in American history. What truly happened behind the ornate gates of the Wycliffe Institute? And how did three of the most respected figures of their time orchestrate a century of horrors in plain sight? The answers lie buried, not just in the cold Appalachian earth, but in the brittle pages of documents that were never meant to see the light of day. This channel is not for everyone. We delve into the shadows that respectable history tries to ignore. If you are a brave soul, a seeker of the unsettling truth, then you have found your community. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and comment with your location to let us know where in the world you're joining us from as we unearth the macabre history of the Wycliffe family. This is a tale that will not only chill you to the bone, but will force you to question the very nature of the histories we are told, the monuments we build, and the smiling faces of the monsters who walk among us. The narrative of the Wycliffes is not a simple one of good versus evil, but a far more terrifying exploration of how unchecked power, sanctified by public adoration, can curdle into an unimaginable nightmare. The evidence suggests a conspiracy of silence that stretched for generations, protected by wealth, influence, and the sheer, unthinkable audacity of their crimes. The children who were sent to the Wycliffe Institute were the vulnerable, the forgotten, the orphans, and the outcasts whose disappearance would scarcely ripple the surface of society. They were, in the cold calculus of the Wycliffes, the perfect victims. The Institute was their hunting ground, a meticulously designed laboratory of suffering hidden behind a veneer of Victorian piety and scientific progress. To understand the depths of their depravity, we must first understand the architects of this private hell, the charismatic patriarch, the brilliant but twisted matriarch, and the brutally efficient enforcer who ensured their secrets remained buried. Together, they formed a triumvirate of corruption that turned a sanctuary into a slaughterhouse, a place of learning into a charnel house. Join us as we piece together the fragmented evidence, follow the trail of whispers and warnings that were ignored, and give voice to the silent victims whose stories have been screaming to be heard for over a century. The ground has given up its dead. Now, we must give them their truth. This is not just a story of a haunted place, but a cautionary tale of a darkness that can fester in the human heart, a darkness that, even now, may be hiding behind the most respectable of facades. The journey we are about to embark upon is a descent into a carefully constructed labyrinth of lies, where every corner turned reveals a new and more terrible layer to the saga of the Wycliffe family's sinister legacy and the innocent lives they consumed. To comprehend the sheer scale of the deception, one must travel back to the year 1888, a time of unprecedented industrial growth and staggering social inequality. It was in this era of robber barons and reformers that Alistair Wycliffe first emerged as a figure of national prominence. He was the quintessential man of his age, impossibly wealthy from inherited railroad money, impeccably dressed, and possessing a voice that could soothe the most savage of beasts and charm the most skeptical of investors. Alastair was the charismatic leader, the public face of the Wycliffe dynasty. He spoke with the fire of a revivalist preacher about the plight of the urban poor, specifically the scores of children left orphaned or destitute by the relentless march of progress. In city after city, he delivered impassioned speeches, his rhetoric painting vivid pictures of a better world, a world where every child, no matter their station, could be molded into a productive and virtuous citizen. His vision was the Wycliffe Institute for Wayward Youth, a revolutionary concept that promised not the grim, punitive environment of the era's workhouses, but a bucolic sanctuary nestled in the pristine mountains of West Virginia. It would be, he declared in a widely published manifesto, a crucible where the forgotten dross of society is forged into the gold of the American future. This was his great promise, and the public, desperate for heroes and simple solutions to complex problems, adored him for it. They saw a savior, a philanthropist whose generosity knew no bounds. They did not see the predator's gleam in his eyes, a detail later noted in the private correspondence of a wary rival. But Alastair was not the sole architect of this grand design. His power was amplified and made terrifyingly effective by the two people closest to him. His wife, Dr. Eleanor Wycliffe, was the operations methodical specialist. A graduate of one of the few medical colleges that accepted women, Eleanor was brilliant, aloof, and utterly detached. She was a fervent believer in the burgeoning and deeply flawed science of eugenics. While Alastair charmed the masses, Eleanor penned scholarly articles on the importance of heredity, social hygiene, and the necessity of culling undesirable traits from the human population for the betterment of the race. She was the intellectual engine of the enterprise, providing the pseudoscientific justification for the horrors that would unfold. Her writings, when read today, are a chilling testament to a mind that saw human beings not as individuals with souls, but as a collection of genetic data points to be manipulated and, if necessary, eliminated. Completing the triumvirate was Alastair's younger brother, Marcus Wycliffe, the practical enforcer. Devoid of Alastair's charm or Eleanor's intellect, Marcus possessed a grounded, brutish practicality. He was a man of logistics and security, a former Pinkerton agent who understood how to make problems and people disappear. While Alastair built the gilded facade and Eleanor designed the monstrous machinery within, Marcus was the one who made sure it all ran smoothly and silently. He oversaw the construction of the Institute, insisting on features that seemed odd at the time: walls that were too high, cellars that were too deep, and an incinerator that was far too large for a facility of its stated size. He managed the hiring of staff, preferring individuals with questionable pasts and a desperate need for employment, ensuring their loyalty through a mixture of fear and financial dependency. Together, these three formed a perfectly corrupt and self-contained unit. Alastair's charisma brought in the money and the children. Eleanor's twisted science dictated their fates, and Marcus's ruthless efficiency ensured that the Institute's pristine reputation remained untarnished by the grim reality it concealed. The founding of the Wycliffe Institute was hailed as a landmark of humanitarian progress, a beacon of hope in a troubled age. But for the vulnerable children who would be sent there, it was the beginning of a nightmare from which there would be no escape, a sinister enterprise built by a charming monster, a cold-blooded scientist, and a ruthless manager. The foundation was laid, the trap was set, and the world applauded. The first carriages, carrying the first innocent souls, were already making their way up the winding mountain road, unaware that they were traveling not towards a brighter future, but into the very heart of an American Gothic horror. The Wycliffe Institute was not built to be a school. It was constructed as a fortress, a self-contained kingdom ruled by the absolute and unquestioned authority of its creators. Perched atop a remote mountain plateau, accessible by a single easily guarded road, its very geography screamed isolation. Alastair Wycliffe, in his public addresses, romanticized this seclusion, describing it as a way to protect the children from the corrupting influences of the cities from which they were rescued. He spoke of clean mountain air and the restorative power of nature. But the truth, as always, was far more sinister. The isolation was not for the children's protection, but for the Wycliffe's impunity. It was a geographic gag order, ensuring that no scream, no desperate plea for help, would ever reach the outside world. The architecture of the main building was a disquieting blend of Gothic revival and institutional austerity, its grand, vaulted entrance and ornate stone carvings giving way to interiors that were cold, sterile, and unervingly practical. The windows, tall and narrow like those of a medieval keep, were fitted with reinforced glass and subtle iron bars woven into their frames, a detail Marcus Wycliffe had personally overseen. From a distance, the institute looked like a grand cathedral to philanthropy. Up close, its windows resembled dead, vacant eyes staring out over a captive kingdom. The sprawling grounds were meticulously manicured in the areas visible from the main road, boasting lush gardens and pristine lawns. But beyond this carefully curated facade, the landscape grew wild and foreboding. The woods were dense and tangled, the terrain treacherous. The entire property was encircled by a formidable wrought iron fence, its spear-like tips a stark warning to those who might contemplate escape. This was the Gilded Cage, a place of profound and terrifying beauty, where every architectural detail, every landscaping choice served a dual purpose: to impress the visiting patrons and to imprison the silent inhabitants. The daily routine within this cage was a rigid, unyielding regimen designed by Eleanor Wycliffe herself. It was a system built on the principles of absolute control and psychological subjugation. The children, known only as wards, were stripped of their names and assigned numbers upon arrival. Their days were a monotonous cycle of grueling physical labor in the Institute's farm fields, rote memorization of texts approved by Eleanor, and mandatory attendance at Alastair's sermons, where he would preach about gratitude and obedience. Any infraction, no matter how minor, a whispered word after lights out, a dropped tool in the workshop, a moment of perceived insolence, was met with swift and severe punishment, administered by a staff of preceptors handpicked by Marcus. These punishments were not simple canings or lost privileges. They were calculated exercises in cruelty, designed to break the spirit. Solitary confinement in the deep, lightless cellars, deprivation of food and water, and bizarre, ritualistic humiliations were common. An early hint of the darkness festering within the Institute's walls comes from a suppressed letter, discovered only recently in a sealed county court file. It was written in 1895 by a young nurse named Clara Jennings, who had been hired to work in the infirmary. Her letter, addressed to her sister, begins with glowing praise for the Institute's mission, but quickly descends into a paranoid, fearful ramble. "There is a coldness here that has nothing to do with the mountain air," she wrote, her elegant script growing frantic and jagged. "Dr. Wycliffe, Eleanor, her eyes are like chips of ice. She conducts examinations in her private laboratory, and the children who go in are never quite the same when they come out. They are quieter, emptier. Some do not come out at all. Last week, little Thomas, number 73, a boy with a clubfoot, was taken for a special treatment. The official record states he was transferred to a specialist in Baltimore. But Marcus was seen by the incinerator late that night, and the air smelled foul and sweet. I ask questions, but the other staff look through me. They are either blind or terrified. I fear I may be in danger. Alastair Wycliffe speaks of angels, but I believe he has built a palace for demons." Clara Jennings vanished 2 weeks after that letter was postmarked. The Institute's official record, signed by Alastair Wycliffe, states she left her position abruptly in the middle of the night, having stolen a small amount of money from the dispensary. No investigation was ever conducted. Her letter stands as a chilling early testament from inside the walls, a desperate cry from a woman who saw the truth and paid the ultimate price for it. Her voice, silenced for over a century, was one of the first to describe the Gilded Cage for what it was, not a sanctuary for the lost, but a hunting preserve for the cruel, where the veneer of civility was thinner than paper, and the cost of curiosity was absolute. The Wycliffe family's reign of terror could not have been sustained without an almost preternatural ability to manage their public image and neutralize any external threats. Their first significant test came in the form of a dogged local journalist named Arthur Poe. In the summer of 1902, Poe, the editor and sole reporter for the small-town newspaper, the Appalachian Herald, began to notice a series of quiet anomalies connected to the Institute. It started with whispers from townspeople who provided supplies to the facility, talk of strangely furtive staff, of orders for medical supplies that seemed excessive and peculiar, including large quantities of chloroform and morphine. More troubling to Poe was the complete lack of integration between the Institute's children and the local community. For an institution that claimed to be preparing children for productive lives, none were ever seen in town, none were ever enrolled in local apprenticeships, and none ever seemed to graduate or leave. The Wycliffe Institute was a black box, a void into which people entered and from which nothing ever emerged. Arthur Poe was the archetypal uncoverer of truth, persistent analytical, and possessing a deeply ingrained skepticism of unchecked authority. He began his investigation subtly, cross-referencing public birth and census records with the few available intake logs from the institute that Alastair had supplied to the county for tax purposes. He discovered a disturbing pattern. Dozens of children officially registered as wards of the institute seemed to have simply vanished from existence. They were not recorded as transferred, deceased, or having reached the age of majority. They were just gone. Emboldened, Poe decided to visit the institute unannounced, under the guise of writing a laudatory feature story on its philanthropic success. Alastair Wycliffe, ever the charming host, greeted him personally. He gave Poe a carefully curated tour of the public-facing areas, showing off the gleaming kitchens, the impressive library filled with unread books, and the happy, cherubic faces of the youngest children, who had clearly been coached for the performance. But Poe was observant. He noted the emptiness in the children's eyes, the way they flinched at the approach of a preceptor. He saw the fortress-like construction and felt a palpable sense of dread. In his journal he later wrote, "Mr. Wycliffe speaks with the tongue of a seraph, but his magnificent school feels like a beautifully appointed tomb. There is a silence here that is not peaceful, but absolute." During the visit, Poe made a calculated error. He asked Alastair a question that was too direct, too pointed. "Mr. Wycliffe," he inquired, "I have been reviewing the county records and find myself unable to account for some 87 wards who were admitted between 1890 and 1900. Could you perhaps provide me with their current status or whereabouts for my article?" The effect was instantaneous. As Poe described it, Alastair Wycliffe's smile did not falter, but a shadow passed behind his eyes, a sudden glacial coldness that belied his warm demeanor. It was as if a mask had slipped just for a second, revealing the predator beneath. Alastair deflected the question with practiced ease, promising his staff would compile the necessary records and forward them. The records, of course, never arrived. Instead, the Wycliffe machine whirred into motion. Within a week, a story began to circulate in the nearby towns, a vicious rumor campaign painting Arthur Poe as a drunkard, a fabricator of stories, and a man with a personal vendetta against Mr. Wycliffe, who had supposedly refused him a loan. Alastair's agents visited the Herald's few advertisers, subtly suggesting their business might be better served elsewhere. Marcus Wycliffe paid a visit to the owner of the building, where Poe rented his small office and press, and the lease was abruptly terminated. Simultaneously, Alastair Wycliffe used his considerable influence with larger, statewide newspapers to plant a story praising the Institute, effectively preempting and discrediting any negative reporting Poe might attempt. Poe found himself isolated, his reputation in tatters. His attempts to publish his findings were met with rejection and ridicule. He was branded a crank, a conspiracy theorist. The charismatic leader had masterfully turned the tables, casting the investigator as the villain and himself as the victim of a malicious smear. The ordeal broke Arthur Poe. He lost his newspaper, his standing in the community, and ultimately, his will to fight. He died a few years later, a forgotten man. His meticulously compiled notes and evidence were dismissed as the ravings of a madman and were packed away into a dusty box in a county storage annex, where they would remain unread for more than a century. The Wycliffes had weathered their first storm. They had proven that their power extended far beyond the iron gates of their institute. They could not only silence the screams within, but could also crush any voice that dared to question them from the outside. The story of Arthur Poe served as a chilling lesson to any who might follow in his footsteps. The truth was a dangerous thing to pursue, and the Wycliffes would stop at nothing to ensure their dark secrets remained buried deep within the cold Appalachian soil. While Alastair charmed the world and Marcus enforced its silence, the true heart of the Wycliffe Institute's monstrous purpose beat within the sterile, tiled walls of Dr. Eleanor Wycliffe's private laboratory. Here, in this pristine, light-filled chamber that starkly contrasted with the Gothic gloom of the rest of the building, the full, horrifying scope of their enterprise was realized. Eleanor was the methodical specialist, and her specialty was the perversion of science into an instrument of unspeakable cruelty. Her work was her religion, and its central doctrine was a fanatical belief in eugenics, a philosophy that she believed gave her the moral and intellectual authority to decide who was fit to live and who was a detriment to the human race. The children of the Institute were not students in her eyes. They were test subjects, a captive population of inferior stock, upon which she could test her appalling theories without ethical constraint or oversight. Her laboratory was a temple to this belief. It was equipped with the finest medical and scientific instruments money could buy, gleaming autoclaves, powerful microscopes, and intricate surgical tools, all arranged with a terrifying, obsessive precision. One section of the lab was dedicated to anthropometry, where she would meticulously measure every aspect of the children's bodies, skulls, limbs, facial features, compiling vast ledgers of data in an attempt to identify the physical markers of criminality, feeble-mindedness, and moral decay. These ledgers, discovered intact in a hidden safe after the Institute's fall, are a testament to her cold detachment. Children are referred to only by their assigned numbers, their human qualities reduced to columns of figures next to chilling. Handwritten notes like Subject 112, exhibits pronounced simian features, indicative of primitive aggression. Prognosis, poor, or Subject 84. Cranial capacity suggests congenital intellectual deficiency, a prime candidate for sterilization protocols. Her recently uncovered private journal, a document so vile it was initially sealed by the court, provides an unvarnished look into her mindset. The prose is precise, emotionless, and utterly terrifying. She saw her work not as evil, but as a noble, if difficult, calling. Humanity is a garden, she wrote in an entry from 1899. One cannot allow the weeds to choke out the blossoms. To prune the diseased branches is not an act of cruelty, but one of profound responsibility. Alastair brings me the raw material, the wild, untended growths. It is my sacred duty to study them, to understand their defects, and where necessary, to root them out completely. Sentiment is the enemy of progress. Pity is a luxury the future cannot afford. This pruning took many forms. Her experiments ranged from nutritional deprivation studies, where she would systematically starve groups of children to observe the physical and psychological effects, to pharmacological trials using dangerous, untested psychoactive compounds meant to correct deviant behavior. The most horrific of her pursuits, however, were surgical. Under the guise of corrective medicine, she performed countless unnecessary and often fatal operations. She conducted experimental brain surgeries on children she deemed aggressive, attempting to locate and sever the parts of the brain responsible for free will. She practiced forced sterilization on adolescent girls she considered genetically unfit to reproduce. These procedures were carried out without anesthesia, which she considered an unnecessary expense for unfeeling subjects, and often with the assistance of only one or two terrified, captive nurses who knew their own lives depended on their silence. The infirmary, which Nurse Clara Jennings had written about in her panicked letter, was merely a triage station for this chamber of horrors. Children with minor illnesses were sometimes treated, but those with chronic conditions, physical disabilities, or rebellious spirits were simply marked for Eleanor's laboratory. The special treatments Clara mentioned were a one-way trip. The club-footed boy, Thomas, number 73, was not transferred to Baltimore. Eleanor's journal details his fate with chilling clarity. He was the subject of a brutal vivisection, his body dissected while he was still alive, so she could study the physiological manifestations of congenital deformity. His remains, like those of so many others, were then taken by Marcus to the oversized incinerator. Dr. Eleanor Wycliffe was, perhaps, the most purely evil of the triumvirate. While Alistair craved adoration and Marcus sought control, Eleanor was driven by a cold, fanatical ideology that transformed murder into a scientific imperative. She was a high priestess of a dark religion of her own making, and the children of the Wycliffe Institute were the human sacrifices she laid upon its unholy altar, their suffering a mere data point in her monstrous quest for a purer humanity. If Alistair was the voice of the Wycliffe conspiracy and Eleanor its demented brain, then Marcus Wycliffe was its iron fist. He was the practical enforcer, the man who translated his brother's charismatic vision and his sister-in-law's monstrous theories into a brutally efficient, operational reality. He was the silent partner, rarely seen by outsiders and never quoted in the press. Yet his influence was present in every locked door, every barred window, and every terrified silence that permeated the Institute. Marcus was a man fundamentally shaped by his past as a Pinkerton agent during the violent labor disputes of the late 19th century. In that role, he had learned the dark arts of intimidation, union busting, and making inconvenient people vanish. He brought this skill set to the secluded mountain kingdom his brother had envisioned. His domain was the physical world of the Institute, its security, its logistics, and the grim, unspoken necessities of its criminal enterprise. He was the one who ensured the walls were not just high, but unscalable, the gates not just locked, but perpetually guarded. He managed a small, hand-picked security force, composed of men much like himself, hard, desperate individuals with violent pasts and no questions asked, their loyalty bought and paid for. Their primary job was not just to keep the children in, but to keep the outside world out. They patrolled the perimeter with dogs, manned a guardhouse at the single point of entry, and monitored all deliveries and communications, ensuring the Institute remained a sealed, impenetrable world. Marcus's most critical role, however, was in handling the disappearances. When Eleanor's experiments reached their fatal conclusions, it was Marcus who took charge of the aftermath. He was the master of disposal. Testimony from a former groundskeeper, unearthed during the final investigation, paints a chilling picture of Marcus's methodical routine. He was a man of schedules, the groundskeeper stated, his voice trembling even decades later. Every few weeks, sometimes more, there'd be a late-night burn. He'd do it himself. We all knew what it was. 4. The infirmary back door would open, and he'd wheel a heavy cart over to the incinerator building. He never let anyone near it. The smoke that came out, it wasn't right. It was thick, greasy, and had a sickly sweet smell that clung to everything. He told us he was burning medical waste and animal carcasses from the farm. We knew better. We just knew to keep our heads down and our mouths shut if we wanted to see the sunrise. Beyond the incinerator, Marcus was also responsible for the unmarked graves that were eventually discovered. When the sheer number of victims grew too large for even the oversized incinerator to handle without attracting unwanted attention, he began to use the apple orchard. Under the cover of darkness, he would transport the small bodies, wrapped in burlap sacks, to the far corner of the property and bury them in deep, methodical rows. The apple trees, a symbol of life and knowledge, were planted above them as a grotesque and cynical camouflage. He also managed the silencing of dissent, both inside and outside the Institute's walls. When Nurse Clara Jennings began asking questions, it was Marcus who confronted her. Her fate remains unknown, but it is almost certain that he was her murderer. When journalist Arthur Poe began his investigation, it was Marcus who carried out the practical aspects of his character assassination, threatening his landlord and intimidating his associates. He was a blunt instrument of terror. His methods were direct, ruthless, and brutally effective. A recovered internal ledger, kept in Marcus's own blocky, pragmatic handwriting, details the discharge records for dozens of children. Beside each name is a single chillingly mundane code: TR for transferred, ESC for escaped, or EXP for expired. The vast majority are marked EXP. For many of these, a second, even more sinister notation is added. Specimen to EW. A clear reference to the victim's body being delivered to Eleanor Wycliffe's laboratory before final disposal. This ledger is a cold, bureaucratic record of systematic murder, a testament to Marcus's role as the logistical linchpin of the entire operation. He was the manager of death, the janitor of atrocities. He felt no remorse, for he saw the children as nothing more than inventory, a problem to be managed. While Alastair delivered soaring speeches about nurturing the future, Marcus was in the shadows, digging the graves that would hold it. He was the silent, brutal gear in the Wycliffe machine, the man who handled the blood and bone, ensuring that the pristine public image of the Institute remained spotless, washed clean by the fires he so diligently tended in the dead of night. His pragmatism was, in its own way, as terrifying as Eleanor's fanaticism or Alastair's deceit. He was the one who made the unthinkable possible. The true weight of the Wycliffes' crimes cannot be measured in ledgers or academic theories, but in the lost lives of the vulnerable, the children whose isolation and powerlessness made them the ideal targets. They were the orphans of industrial accidents, the children of penniless immigrants who spoke no English, the problem sons and daughters of wealthy families who wanted them out of sight, and the countless others who occupied the margins of society. Their stories, by design, were meant to be erased. The Wycliffes chose them precisely because they knew no one would come looking for them. To give substance to this tragedy, we must focus on the fragmented histories of the few we can identify, piecing together their existence from the cold data of intake forms and the horrific notations in Eleanor's journals. Consider the case of Sophia, number 142. She was a 10-year-old girl, the daughter of Polish immigrants who had perished in a textile mill fire in Paterson, New Jersey. She arrived at the Institute in 1905, a small, terrified child who spoke only a few words of English. She was deemed a perfect subject by Eleanor, who saw her as a blank slate, an example of primitive European stock. For months, Sophia was subjected to a battery of psychological conditioning experiments. Eleanor attempted to erase her Polish identity and language through a brutal regimen of punishment and reward, documented with chilling objectivity in her notes. Subject 142 displays remarkable resistance to linguistic reprogramming, Eleanor wrote. Despite repeated negative stimuli associated with her native tongue, she reverts under stress. This suggests a deeply ingrained, almost tribal, stubbornness common to her people. Sophia's stubbornness was her humanity, her desperate grip on the only identity she had ever known. That humanity was her death sentence. Deemed a failure, she was reassigned to a new protocol, a study on the physiological effects of extreme fear. Eleanor's journal describes how Sophia was repeatedly exposed to her deepest terrors in a controlled environment, her heart rate and adrenal responses meticulously recorded. The final entry on Sophia reads simply, Subject 142 expired due to cardiac arrest during Protocol 7. An interesting, if predictable, outcome. Body sent to M for standard disposal. Sophia was not just murdered. Her very soul was dissected for the sake of a monstrous hypothesis. Then there was the story of two brothers, Eli and Samuel, aged 12 and 14, numbers 98 and 99. They were street-smart orphans from the Lower East Side of New York, sent to the Institute by a well-meaning but naive charity. They were inseparable, and their bond was a source of strength, which the Wycliffes could not tolerate. Alastair saw their mutual loyalty as a form of rebellion, a gang mentality that needed to be broken. He personally took on the task of their re-education. He would separate them, pitting them against each other, offering privileges to whichever brother would inform on the other. In his sermons, he would use them as examples of the sickness of familial dependency versus the virtue of institutional loyalty. When this psychological torment failed to break them, they were handed over to Marcus for a more direct approach. They were assigned the most grueling labor, their food rations cut, and they were subjected to constant physical abuse from the preceptors. Their crime was their love for each other. Their story culminates in a failed escape attempt. Having managed to scale a section of the outer fence during a storm, they made it 3 miles into the dense, unforgiving woods before Marcus's dogs hunted them down. What happened next was designed as a spectacle of terror for the other children. Eli and Samuel were brought back and in front of the entire assembled institute were accused by Alastair of base ingratitude and treachery. He spoke of them as if they were venomous snakes he had welcomed into his home. Then, he turned them over to the preceptors. The official record, written by Marcus, states they succumbed to injuries sustained during their ill-advised escape. The truth, pieced together from later testimony, is that they were beaten to death as an example to the others. These are but 2 stories among a potential 148. Each number in Eleanor's ledgers, each unmarked grave in the orchard, represents a life as real and as full of potential as Sophia's or Eli's. They were children who loved, feared, and dreamed. The Wycliffes did not just take their lives, they systematically unmade them, stripping them of their names, their histories, their dignity, and finally, their very existence, all to serve a monstrous ideology and a lust for absolute power. If you find this story as horrifying and as important as we do, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others. Spreading this awareness is the only way to give these forgotten victims a voice. And be sure to subscribe, because what comes next in the Wycliffe saga is the beginning of the end, the first cracks that would appear in their impenetrable fortress of evil, leading to its eventual cataclysmic collapse. The story of their downfall is as crucial as the story of their crimes. For nearly 3 decades, the Wycliffe Institute operated with a chilling and absolute impunity. The initial inquiries of men like Arthur Poe had been brutally quashed, serving as a powerful deterrent to any further scrutiny. The family's wealth and Alastair's carefully cultivated public persona created an almost impenetrable shield. Inside the isolated mountain fortress, the horrors escalated. With each passing year, the Wycliffes grew bolder, their sense of godlike entitlement swelling with every successful deception. The systematic torture and murder of children became routine, a mundane aspect of the Institute's daily operations, as commonplace as the ringing of the dinner bell or the changing of the seasons. The period between 1910 and 1920 marked the apex of their depravity, a time when the sheer volume of their crimes became a logistical challenge that required even more monstrous solutions. The incinerator, tended to by Marcus with grim diligence, burned almost nightly. The secret graveyard in the apple orchard expanded, row by silent row. Eleanor's experiments grew ever more grotesque and ambitious. Emboldened by her isolation and the endless supply of subjects, she moved beyond eugenic culling and into the realm of truly monstrous experimentation. Her journals from this period describe attempts to create a superior human through a combination of surgical alteration and a cocktail of dangerous, unproven chemical serums. She subjected children to extreme temperatures to test the limits of human endurance, performed organ transplants between living subjects, and documented the progression of untreated diseases she had deliberately introduced into the captive population. The Institute became a veritable factory of death, its productivity measured in the number of failed experiments and expired subjects. The inciting incident that marked a critical escalation, a point of no return even for the Wycliffes, occurred in the winter of 1917. It was a mass casualty event, born not from a single experiment, but from a catastrophic failure of their system. A particularly virulent strain of influenza, which Eleanor had been studying in a small, isolated group of children, broke free of her laboratory's quarantine. It swept through the malnourished and weakened population of the Institute with terrifying speed. A normal institution would have sought immediate medical help from the outside world. For the Wycliffes, this was an impossibility. Calling in outside doctors would mean exposing everything: the emaciated bodies of the children, the signs of long-term abuse, the fortress-like conditions, and the very existence of Eleanor's lab. Exposure was the one thing they feared more than death itself. Alastair made the decision. The Institute would handle the crisis internally. This meant no doctors, no medicine beyond their own limited and perverted stores, and no hope. The Wycliffe Institute was officially sealed off from the world under the public pretext of a preventative quarantine to protect the children from the pandemic raging outside. The irony was as thick as the funeral smoke that would soon choke the valley. For 3 weeks, hell was unleashed within the walls. Children died in their cold dormitories, their pleas for help answered only by the detached observations of Eleanor, who saw the disaster as a unique opportunity to study a pandemic's effects on a closed population. She walked the halls of the dying, not as a healer, but as a scientist, her notebook filling with data on fever curves and mortality rates. Marcus and his men were tasked with the grim logistics of body disposal on an unprecedented scale. The incinerator could not keep up. A new long trench was dug in the apple orchard, a mass grave to hold the dozens of small victims. The few surviving staff members, trapped inside with the dying children, were pushed to the brink of sanity. One of these was a young preceptor named Thomas Hayes. He was a man who had come to the Institute for a steady job, turning a blind eye to the everyday cruelty out of fear and self-preservation. But the pandemic shattered his fragile composure. The sheer scale of the death, the agonized cries of children he had once disciplined, broke through his wall of willful ignorance. A secret diary he kept, later found beneath a floorboard in his room, documents the unfolding nightmare. "The Great Hall has become a morgue," he wrote, his handwriting a barely legible scrawl. "They are dying everywhere. Eleanor walks among them like a ghost, taking notes. She offers no comfort, no medicine. Alistair delivered a sermon yesterday, standing over the bodies, speaking of God's mysterious will and the testing of our faith. It was the speech of a madman or a demon. Marcus and his brutes dragged the bodies out at night. So many bodies. He warned us. You see nothing. You say nothing. But I see it all. I see it in my dreams. This is not God's will. This is a slaughter. This is the house of the devil." The pandemic eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a horrifying silence and a decimated population. More than 40 children had perished in under a month. The Wycliffes had managed to keep their secret, but the event had changed something. The sheer audacity required to conceal a disaster of this magnitude created a sense of absolute invincibility. They had stared into the abyss and had not flinched. They believed they were untouchable, that there was no crime so great they could not bury it, no sin so dark they could not preach it away. This arrogant belief, this hubris born from a successful cover-up of a mass casualty event, would be the seed of their eventual destruction. They had escalated their crimes beyond the pale, and in doing so, had set the stage for a reckoning that was now, however slowly, becoming inevitable. The impenetrable fortress of the Wycliffe family finally began to show its first true cracks in the spring of 1922, not from an outside investigator, but from within. The catalyst was not a hardened journalist or a suspicious official, but a 17-year-old girl known only as Subject 204. Her real name was Rose, and she was the new uncoverer of truth, an observant victim who had spent a decade navigating the treacherous currents of the Institute. Rose had arrived as a 7-year-old orphan, and unlike many others, she had survived through a careful strategy of quiet observation and feigned compliance. She learned to read the moods of the preceptors, to anticipate the desires of Alistair, and to avoid the icy gaze of Eleanor. She saw what happened to the rebellious, the weak, and the curious. She saw the disappearances, smelled the smoke from the incinerator, and felt the silent terror that was the air she breathed. But survival had not extinguished her spirit. It had forged it into a sharp, analytical weapon. Her chance came not through force, but through cunning. Over the years, Rose had been assigned to various work duties, including laundry and cleaning in the main administrative building. It was a position of trust she had carefully cultivated. This gave her fleeting, precious access to the inner sanctum of the Wycliffe operation. She learned to read documents upside down on desks, memorized the patterns of the security patrols, and noted the comings and goings from Eleanor's forbidden laboratory. Her inciting incident was the death of a younger girl named Lily, a frail child of about 8 with whom Rose had formed a secret, protective friendship. Lily was taken to the infirmary with a cough and never returned. The official story was that she had been transferred to a sanatorium. But Rose, during her cleaning duties, saw Lily's small, worn boots in a disposal bin near the incinerator. The sight of those boots broke something inside her. The passive strategy of survival was no longer enough. The memory of Lily demanded justice. For months, Rose meticulously planned her escape. It was not a desperate, impulsive flight like the one undertaken by the ill-fated Eli and Samuel. It was a calculated, high-stakes gambit. She began to steal small things not for their value, but for their utility. A paring knife from the kitchen, a spool of sturdy thread from the sewing room, and her most important prize, a single page torn from Marcus's discharge ledger that she had glimpsed during a moment of rare inattention. The page contained a list of 5 names, all marked EXP, with a chilling specimen to EW notation. It was concrete proof, a Rosetta Stone of the Institute's crimes. She studied the geography of the land, noting that the supply wagon that came once a week had a brief, 2-minute pause at the main gate as the guards checked the driver's papers. The wagon was her only hope. On a moonless night in April, Rose put her plan into motion. She slipped out of the dormitory during the chaotic shift change of the preceptors. Using the stolen knife, she pried open a loose floorboard in a storage closet, where she had hidden her meager supplies and the precious ledger page. She made her way to the rear of the main building, moving through the shadows with a familiarity born of a decade of fear. She hid herself in the dense bushes near the main gate, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When the supply wagon arrived just before dawn, she seized her moment. In the brief window of the security check, she scrambled from her hiding place, crawled under the wagon's heavy canvas tarp, and burrowed herself deep amongst sacks of flour and potatoes. The journey down the winding mountain road was agonizing, every jolt and bump a fresh wave of terror. She was convinced that at any moment the wagon would be stopped, that she would be discovered and dragged back to a fate worse than death. But the wagon continued its slow descent, leaving the kingdom of the Wycliffes behind. When it finally stopped in the small, sleepy town of Oakhaven, Rose slipped out and vanished into the unfamiliar world. She was free, but she was also alone, penniless, and hunted. She knew Marcus would be searching for her, that his reach extended far beyond the Institute's gates. Her journey, to be believed, would be an odyssey fraught with danger and disbelief, but she carried with her a truth so potent and a piece of evidence so damning that it had the power to bring the entire Wycliffe empire crashing down. The escape of Subject 204 was the first tremor of an earthquake. A single, courageous girl had breached the walls and was now loose in the world, carrying the names of the dead on a crumpled piece of paper and the story of 100 others in her heart. The slow, grinding wheels of justice had, at long last, begun to turn. Rose's newfound freedom was not a relief, but the beginning of a new kind of terror. The world outside the Institute was a bewildering and hostile place for a young woman with no money, no connections, and a story so monstrous it bordered on the unbelievable. For weeks, she lived on the fringes, sleeping in barns and surviving on stolen fruit, haunted by the constant fear of discovery. She knew Marcus Wycliffe and his network of agents would be scouring the countryside for her. Every friendly stranger was a potential enemy, every helping hand a possible trap. Her first attempts to tell her story were met with failure and derision. She approached a local sheriff in a small town, a portly, complacent man who listened to her frantic tale of murder and experimentation with a patronizing smile. He saw not a credible witness, but a hysterical, runaway girl, likely a delinquent from a reform school. He patted her on the head, told her to calm down, and threatened to lock her up for vagrancy if she didn't move along. The Wycliffe's pristine reputation was a shield that even a first-hand account could not easily pierce. The experience taught Rose a harsh lesson. The truth was not enough. She needed a powerful ally, someone who would not only listen, but would have the authority to act. Her stolen ledger page was her only currency. She remembered the name of the persistent journalist Arthur Poe from hushed whispers among the older children years ago. how he had tried to expose the Wycliffes and been destroyed for it. She gambled that the embers of his investigation might still exist somewhere. Her journey led her to the county seat, where she began a discreet and painstaking search for Poe's work. It was there that she finally found him, not the man himself, who had died years prior in obscurity, but his legacy, locked away in the county records office. It was also there that she encountered the man who would become the champion of her cause, Deputy Marshal Frank Donovan. Donovan was a rarity in the region, a former big-city detective from Philadelphia who had taken a quieter federal post in Appalachia after his career was stalled by his refusal to bow to political corruption. He was a man of immense patience and a deep, abiding cynicism about human nature. When Rose first approached him, he was as skeptical as everyone else. But something in her demeanor, a raw and terrified authenticity that could not be faked, made him pause. And then she showed him the ledger page. Donovan, a man trained to see the patterns in chaos, immediately recognized the significance of the document. The blocky handwriting, the cold bureaucratic notations of EXP and specimen to EW, spoke to a level of systematic criminality that chilled him to the bone. It was not the work of a lone killer, but of an organization. He agreed to hear her full story. For 2 days in the back room of a dusty courthouse office, Rose recounted everything she had witnessed over the past decade. The numbered children, the sermons of Alistair, the icy terror of Eleanor's lab, the brutal efficiency of Marcus, the disappearances, the pandemic, and the story of Lily's boots. Donovan listened without interruption, his initial skepticism melting away, replaced by a growing sense of horror and outrage. He realized he was looking at the key to an atrocity of unimaginable scale. The investigation began in secret. Donovan knew that a direct assault on the Wycliffe Institute would be futile. The family's power was too entrenched. He would be stonewalled, and his key witness, Rose, would be targeted. He placed Rose in protective custody at a remote safe house and began to work the case from the periphery, starting with the ghost of Arthur Poe. He located the late journalist's boxed-up notes in the county annex, just as Rose had hoped. Reading through Poe's meticulous research from 20 years earlier was a revelation. It provided the historical context and corroboration for Rose's testimony, showing a long-standing pattern of disappearances and deception. Poe's work gave Donovan a list of names, dates, and vanished children that stretched back decades. Armed with this and Rose's testimony, Donovan began to quietly re-interview people Poe had spoken to, many of whom were now elderly and more willing to talk. He found the retired supplier who remembered the strange orders for chloroform. He located the son of the landlord Marcus had threatened. A picture began to form, a mosaic of fear and suspicion that had surrounded the Institute for years. But the Wycliffes were not idle. Marcus, through his network, learned that a federal lawman was asking questions. The family's response was swift and predictable. Donovan found his investigation suddenly stymied by bureaucratic roadblocks. Files he requested went missing. Local officials, who had promised cooperation, suddenly became evasive and hostile. Alistair Wycliffe himself paid a visit to Donovan's superior, speaking of a troubled, vindictive runaway and a sadly overzealous federal officer. The pressure to drop the case was immense. Donovan was being isolated, just as Arthur Poe had been. But unlike Poe, Donovan was a federal officer with the full, if slow-moving, weight of the U.S. Marshal Service behind him. And unlike Poe, he had a living witness. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the vast wealth, influence, and malevolence of the Wycliffe family. On the other, a stubborn deputy marshal, the ghost of a dead journalist, and a courageous girl who had survived hell and was now determined to burn it to the ground. The stone-walled investigation was not an end, but the beginning of a long, arduous war for the truth. The Wycliffe family's campaign of influence and intimidation was formidable, effectively grinding Deputy Marshal Donovan's official investigation to a halt. For months, he found himself trapped in a bureaucratic quagmire, his requests for warrants denied, and his reputation under attack from political figures friendly with Alistair Wycliffe. The fortress on the mountain remained impregnable, and the truth remained locked behind its gates. But Donovan was a patient man, and he knew that every seemingly perfect criminal enterprise has a weak point, a human flaw in the machine. He believed that decades of sustained atrocity could not have occurred without leaving a trail of traumatized and guilt-ridden souls. His focus shifted from a direct assault to a search for these cracks in the facade. The key, he reasoned, lay with former employees. While Marcus Wycliffe was ruthlessly efficient at ensuring loyalty through fear, Donovan wagered that not everyone's conscience could be permanently suppressed. He and his team began the painstaking work of tracking down every known individual who had ever worked at the Institute and had subsequently left. Many were dead ends. Some had died, others had vanished, and a significant number refused to speak, their eyes still wide with a decades-old fear of Marcus Wycliffe. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a rundown boarding house in Pittsburgh, where a man named Thomas Hayes was living out his final days, his body ravaged by alcoholism and his mind by ghosts. Hayes was the former preceptor whose diary had chronicled the horrors of the 1917 influenza pandemic within the Institute. He had fled the facility shortly after, his nerves shattered, and had spent the rest of his life drifting, trying to drink away the memories. When Donovan found him, Hayes was a broken man, but the terror was still fresh. At first, he denied everything, his hands shaking, muttering that he knew nothing. But Donovan was persistent. He didn't threaten, he empathized. He spoke to Hayes about Rose, about the countless other children, and about the possibility of redemption. Over several days, Donovan's quiet persistence wore down Hayes's wall of fear. Finally, in a torrent of guilt-ridden sobs, Thomas Hayes began to talk. He recounted everything he had seen, the routine brutality of the preceptors, the godlike pronouncements of Alistair, the ghostly, scientific detachment of Eleanor, and the ever-present, menacing shadow of Marcus. His testimony was a first-hand account from inside the belly of the beast. He described the pandemic in horrifying detail, the mass grave, and the cold-blooded cover-up. Most importantly, he gave Donovan the one thing he desperately needed, a map. From his tortured memory, Hayes drew a crude layout of the Institute's grounds, marking the location of the main buildings, Eleanor's laboratory, and most chillingly, the approximate location of the apple orchard where he had seen Marcus's men digging the long trench. He also provided the location of his old room in the staff quarters, telling Donovan about the loose floorboard under which he had hidden his diary. This was the turning point. Hayes's testimony, combined with Rose's account and Arthur Poe's old notes, formed a powerful trifecta of evidence. It was no longer just the word of a runaway girl against a celebrated philanthropist. It was a corroborated account of systematic abuse and mass murder from a former insider. But the most significant crack in the Wycliffe facade came from a completely different direction: their finances. While investigating Alistair's vast network of charities and holding companies, a forensic accountant on Donovan's team noticed a peculiar and recurring anomaly. Large, regular payments were being made from the Institute's operating budget to a chemical supply company based in Baltimore. This was not unusual for a large institution. What was strange were the chemicals being purchased: industrial-grade caustic lime, hydrochloric acid, and other powerful corrosive agents, ordered in quantities that would be more appropriate for a tannery or an industrial waste facility than a children's home. The amounts were far too great to be explained by simple sanitation or maintenance. Donovan realized with a sickening certainty what he was looking at. The Wycliffes weren't just burying bodies, they were dissolving them. It was a method of disposal that would leave little to no evidence, a way to make people vanish from the very earth itself. The incinerator and the graves were for the early victims. As their operation grew more prolific, they had industrialized their process of destruction. This financial evidence was the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. It was cold, objective proof of a criminal conspiracy. It corroborated the disappearances and suggested a level of premeditated, scientific horror that even Donovan had not fully imagined. The walls were closing in on the Wycliffes. They had built their fortress to be impenetrable from the outside, but they had not accounted for the ghosts they had created, the living and the dead who were now screaming for justice. With the testimony of a survivor, the diary of a guilt-ridden guard, a map to the graves, and the damning evidence of their own financial ledgers, Deputy Marshal Frank Donovan finally had the weapons he needed. He went back to the federal judge who had previously denied his warrant, and this time he did not leave empty-handed. The raid was imminent. The day of reckoning for the House of Wycliffe was at hand. The morning of October 12, 1923, broke cold and clear over the Appalachian peaks. As the sun cast its first pale light on the Gothic spires of the Wycliffe Institute, a convoy of dark, unassuming federal vehicles was already winding its way up the long mountain road. Deputy Marshal Frank Donovan rode in the lead car, the signed federal warrant resting on the seat beside him. This was the culmination of more than a year of tireless investigation, the final act in a drama that had begun decades earlier. There was no grand siren, no dramatic announcement. The raid was planned as a swift, silent, and overwhelming show of force, designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and to capture the three architects of this empire of pain before they could react. As the convoy reached the formidable main gate, the guards on duty, accustomed to a life of unquestioned authority, moved to block the path. Their arrogance quickly evaporated when they were met not by a lost traveler or a humble delivery driver, but by a dozen armed U.S. Marshals emerging from the vehicles, their faces grim and resolute. The gate was opened without a fight. The convoy poured onto the grounds, splitting into three designated teams. The first, led by Donovan himself, headed directly for the main administrative building, their target, Alastair, Eleanor, and Marcus Wycliffe. The second team, armed with Thomas Hayes's diary and map, made for the old staff quarters to secure the preceptor's hidden journal. The third, a larger team accompanied by forensic specialists, drove directly towards the remote apple orchard, the location of the suspected mass grave. The scene inside the main building was one of surreal calm before the storm. The Wycliffe family was at breakfast in their private dining hall, an opulent room paneled with dark wood and decorated with portraits of their ancestors. Alastair was reading a newspaper, Eleanor was making notes in a small ledger, and Marcus was impassively eating his meal. They were so insulated by their power and arrogance that the possibility of such a violation of their sanctuary was literally unthinkable. When Donovan and his men burst through the doors, their initial reaction was not fear, but indignant fury. Alastair Wycliffe rose to his feet, his face a mask of aristocratic outrage. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he boomed, his famous, charismatic voice for once having no effect. "By what authority do you enter my home?" Donovan's reply was cold and simple. He held up the warrant. "Alastair Wycliffe, you are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder." In that moment, the facade that had held for 35 years shattered. Alastair's face went slack with shock. Eleanor's expression remained unervingly placid, her only reaction a slight, contemptuous narrowing of her eyes, as if annoyed by a vulgar interruption. It was Marcus, the pragmatist, who reacted first, his hand instinctively reaching inside his coat. But the marshals were faster, and he was subdued before he could draw his weapon. While the Wycliffe triumvirate was being placed in handcuffs, the other teams were making their own horrific discoveries. In the staff quarters, they found the loose floorboard in Thomas Hayes's old room exactly where he had said it would be. Beneath it lay the small leather-bound diary, its pages filled with his frantic, spidery script, a corroborating voice from the heart of the nightmare. Simultaneously, the team in the apple orchard began its grim work. They didn't need to dig. The ground itself told the story. A long, shallow depression, almost invisible to the untrained eye, ran the length of the orchard. The forensic team began to excavate, and it wasn't long before the first of the horrors was revealed. A shovel struck something solid. It was the small, fragile bone of a child's skeleton. Then another and another. They had found the trench from the 1917 pandemic. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Following Hayes's map and the forensic accountant's leads, Donovan's men located a locked, reinforced door in the basement of the infirmary, a door that did not appear on any official blueprints. They broke it down and were met with the overwhelming chemical stench of caustic lime and decay. They had found Eleanor's final disposal site. It was a chamber of industrial horror, containing large vats filled with a thick, acidic sludge. In this gruesome soup were the dissolving remnants of human bone. This was the fate of the more recent victims, those for whom there was not even the dignity of a secret grave. The raid on the Wycliffe Institute laid bare the full, unvarnished truth. The beautiful campus was a crime scene of unprecedented scale. The evidence was everywhere. In the secret ledgers, in the hidden diary, in the surgical tools and experimental drugs of Eleanor's lab, and in the very soil of the orchard, which was now, finally, giving up its dead. The kingdom of the Wycliffes had fallen. The silence that had shrouded the mountain for so long was finally broken, and the screams of 1,000 lost souls were at last being heard. The trial of Alastair, Eleanor, and Marcus Wycliffe, which began in the spring of 1924, was a national sensation, a spectacle of Gothic horror that captivated and appalled the public in equal measure. The press dubbed it the trial of the century, and for once, the hyperbole was justified. It was a legal proceeding that ripped back the veneer of Gilded Age philanthropy to expose the rot and monstrosity beneath. The prosecution, led by a determined federal attorney, meticulously built its case, brick by horrifying brick. They had a mountain of evidence. The physical remains from the orchard, the damning financial records, the recovered ledgers of both Eleanor and Marcus, Thomas Hayes's diary, and the chilling contents of Eleanor's laboratory. But their most powerful weapon was the testimony of the survivors. Rose, no longer subject to but a poised and articulate young woman, took the stand and held the courtroom spellbound for 3 days. She spoke with a quiet, unshakable dignity, her voice never faltering, as she recounted the daily horrors, the numbered children, the psychological torture, and the disappearances. She put a human face to the victims, telling the stories of Sophia, Lily, and the brothers Eli and Samuel. Her testimony was a powerful indictment that no legal maneuvering could erase. The defense, funded by the last vestiges of the Wycliffe fortune, was aggressive and, at times, desperate. Their strategy was to discredit the witnesses and portray the Wycliffes as the victims of a vast conspiracy born of jealousy and misunderstanding. They painted Rose as a delusional runaway, Thomas Hayes as a disgruntled, alcoholic liar, and Deputy Marshal Donovan as an overzealous glory hound. The character of the 3 defendants in the courtroom presented a fascinating and terrifying study in human evil. Alastair Wycliffe attempted to play the role he had played his entire life, the charismatic leader. He took the stand in his own defense, his voice resonating with its old, practiced charm. He spoke of his love for the children, his noble mission, and the tragic but unavoidable hardships of running such a grand institution. He presented a fabricated narrative of disease and accident, his eyes welling with crocodile tears as he spoke of the beloved wards he had lost. But the charm was gone. In the harsh, objective light of the courtroom, confronted with the irrefutable evidence of his crimes, he no longer looked like a philanthropist. He looked like a monster playing a part. His performance was a failure. The most chilling figure, however, was Dr. Eleanor Wycliffe. She showed no emotion throughout the entire proceeding. She sat ramrod straight, her face an impassive mask, as witnesses described her brutal experiments. When her own journal, filled with its cold-blooded eugenicist ramblings, was read aloud, she merely looked on with an air of intellectual superiority, as if observing a room full of simpletons incapable of grasping her genius. Her testimony was a defiant, unrepentant defense of her life's work. She did not deny the experiments, she justified them. In a moment that stunned the courtroom into silence, she stated, "I regret nothing. My work was not for the sentimentalists of today, but for the betterment of the human race of tomorrow. Society will one day thank me for the difficult choices I was willing to make." There was no insanity plea. There was only a terrifying, absolute belief in her own righteousness. Marcus Wycliffe, true to form, remained silent and sullen. He was the practical enforcer to the very end. He refused to testify, glaring at the prosecution with undisguised hatred. His ledger, with its cold notations of EXP, spoke for him. His guilt was plain and unadorned. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came from the testimony of the former groundskeeper, an elderly man who finally found the courage to speak. He described Marcus's late-night trips to the incinerator, and with a voice trembling with emotion, he told the court, the smoke, it smelled like a nightmare. And sometimes in the wind, you could hear what sounded like prayers from inside the incinerator building before it started. Not from Marcus, from the cart. This image of a child's last, desperate prayers before being consigned to the flames shattered the last vestiges of public sympathy for the family. The jury's deliberation was remarkably short. After months of testimony and evidence, it took them less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Alistair, the charming monster, finally broke. His mask of composure crumbled, and he collapsed into his chair, a weeping, pathetic shell of a man. Marcus snarled at the jury, a caged animal to the last. Eleanor simply stared straight ahead, her expression unchanged, as if the verdict were a mere footnote in her grand, misunderstood legacy. The community that had once hailed the Wycliffes as saviors was left in a state of profound shock and collective guilt, forced to confront the terrible truth that a charnel house had operated in their midst, funded by their donations and shielded by their willful ignorance. The trial was over, but the story was not. The legal system had rendered its judgment, but the true aftermath, the process of accounting for the dead and reckoning with the legacy of the Wycliffe family, had only just begun. The guilty verdict brought a legal end to the Wycliffe family's reign of terror, but the aftermath of their crimes would ripple through generations, leaving a legacy of trauma, unanswered questions, and a permanent scar on the landscape of the nation's conscience. The fates of the 3 architects of the Institute reflected their roles in the conspiracy. Alistair Wycliffe, the broken charismatic leader, was unable to cope with the loss of his reputation and the adoration he craved. Stripped of his public mask, he was nothing. He died by suicide in his prison cell less than a year into his life sentence, leaving behind a rambling, self-pitying note that blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. He remained the star of his own tragic drama to the very end. Marcus Wycliffe, the practical enforcer, adapted to prison life with a grim, silent acceptance. It was, in many ways, an environment he understood, rigid, violent, and governed by unspoken rules. He never spoke of his crimes, never showed a flicker of remorse, and died of a heart attack in the prison yard 2 decades later, as silent and brutal in death as he had been in life. The fate of Dr. Eleanor Wycliffe was, in many ways, the most disturbing. She continued her life's work from behind bars, filling dozens of notebooks with her eugenic theories, surgical diagrams, and philosophical justifications for her actions. She became a dark icon for a burgeoning international eugenics movement, which hailed her as a martyr persecuted by an ignorant society. She received correspondence from followers around the world and never wavered in her belief that she was a misunderstood pioneer. She died of old age in the prison infirmary, unrepentant and utterly convinced of her own genius, a chilling testament to the power of ideology to completely eclipse human empathy. The Wycliffe Institute itself was razed to the ground by federal order. The government, eager to erase the physical reminder of such a profound national shame, demolished the buildings and plowed the land. But a place so saturated in suffering cannot be so easily cleansed. For decades, the site remained a blighted, overgrown tract of land that locals refused to visit, a place of dark legends and ghost stories. The apple orchard, where the earth had been so brutally disturbed, never bore fruit again. The most tragic aspect of the aftermath was the struggle to account for the victims. The discovered remains in the orchard and the evidence of the acid vats accounted for over 150 individuals, but records were incomplete and deliberately obscured. Investigators believed the true number of victims could be significantly higher, perhaps double that number, with countless children having vanished without a single physical trace. For the survivors, like Rose, life was a complex journey. Rose, with the help of Deputy Marshal Donovan, who became a lifelong friend and father figure, dedicated her life to victim advocacy. She worked to establish a memorial on the site of the former institute and fought for the creation of national registries for missing and exploited children. She carried the weight of her past with grace and strength, but the ghosts of the institute never truly left her. She became the voice for the voiceless, ensuring that the stories of Sophia, Lily, Eli, and Samuel would not be forgotten. The Wycliffe case had a profound and lasting impact on social policy. It led to sweeping reforms in the oversight of orphanages, reform schools, and charitable institutions. The era of private unaccountable philanthropic empires came to an end, replaced by a new, more stringent system of state and federal regulation. The public's blind faith in the inherent goodness of the wealthy and powerful was shattered, replaced by a healthy and necessary skepticism. Yet, the question of how this could have happened continued to haunt the American psyche. How did an entire community, an entire nation, remain blind for so long? The answer lies in the seductive power of a simple story, the charisma of a confident leader, and the collective willingness to look away from the suffering of the vulnerable. The Wycliffes did not operate in a vacuum. They operated in a society that wanted to believe in them, a society that was all too willing to hand over its forgotten children and not ask what happened to them. The aftermath of the Wycliffe saga is not a story of neat resolution, but a lingering, somber echo. It is a reminder of the darkness that can fester behind a respectable facade and the profound societal failure that allows it to grow. The dead were buried, the guilty were punished, and the buildings were torn down, but the specter of the Wycliffe Institute remains, a cautionary tale whispered on the mountain winds. The macabre history of the Wycliffe family has now been laid bare, a chilling narrative of ambition, ideology, and unimaginable cruelty. Yet, as we stand at the end of this dark road, looking back at the ashes of the Institute and the unmarked graves in the orchard, we are left with questions that resonate far beyond this single, horrifying case. What does it say about a society when its most vulnerable members can be systematically erased without a whisper of protest? The Wycliffes, for all their monstrous uniqueness, were a product of their time, an age that worshipped wealth, fetishized progress at any human cost, and subscribed to dangerous pseudosciences that justified the persecution of the unfit. But is our own time so different? Do we not still, in our own ways, marginalize the powerless and turn a blind eye to suffering that happens just beyond our immediate view? The story of the Wycliffes is a stark and vital reminder that evil rarely announces itself with monstrous fanfare. It often arrives with a charming smile, a persuasive argument, and the promise of a better world. Alistair Wycliffe was not a horned demon. He was a celebrated public figure, a man lauded for his vision and generosity. Dr. Eleanor Wycliffe was not a mad scientist from a Gothic novel. She was a respected intellectual, a pioneer in her field, whose ideas were discussed and admired in academic circles. They were monsters, yes, but they were monsters who wore the masks of civility and progress, masks that society itself had helped them craft. This tale serves as a profound and cautionary lesson on the danger of unchecked authority and the seductive allure of simplistic solutions to complex social problems. The Wycliffe Institute was founded on a grand promise to take the wayward youth, the forgotten children of the streets, and mold them into perfect citizens. It was a promise so appealing that no one dared to look too closely at the methods being used. It is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. The righteous cause that justifies the horrific means, the utopian dream that becomes a dystopian nightmare. And so, we must ask ourselves the difficult, reflective questions. How do we hold power accountable, especially when it is cloaked in the robes of charity and benevolence? How do we ensure that the voices of the vulnerable, the Roses, the Sophias, the Ellis, are heard and believed, even when they speak a truth that is inconvenient or terrifying? The answers are not simple, and they require a constant state of vigilance, a willingness to be skeptical of charismatic leaders, and a commitment to the fundamental principle that every single human life has value regardless of its station or origin. The legacy of the Wycliffe family is one of pain and loss, but it can also be one of enduring lessons. It teaches us that the true measure of a society's decency is not in the grandeur of its monuments or the wealth of its leaders, but in how it treats its most powerless members. It reminds us that the work of justice is never truly over, and that the fight against the darkness requires brave souls willing to step into the shadows and drag the truth, kicking and screaming, into the light. The story is over, but its echoes remain. What are your thoughts on this haunting chapter of our history? Does it remind you of other stories, other times when good intentions curdled into unimaginable evil? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your engagement is what keeps these crucial stories alive. If this investigation has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, so you never miss an exploration into the darkest corners of the past. Share this video with others who you think need to hear it. For only by remembering the victims of the Wycliffe Institute and understanding the failures that led to their fate, can we hope to honor their memory and ensure that such a nightmare never happens again.